I want to thank you for coming out and continuing to come out for our third day of Adam Smith Week. Right. This afternoon, we have a really great program that I'm excited to tell you about. But first, let me just welcome all of you and introduce myself. I'm Professor Peter Calcano. I'm the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process, professor of economics here at the College of Charleston. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. And we do this through a variety of programming all throughout the year. Primarily focused on students with our speaker series, our economic book colloquiums, our regional reading groups, Adam Smith Week, and our mentoring program, Market Process Scholars. You can follow us on any of the social media platforms to learn what's going on in the events that we're doing. We do also have, obviously, a lot of role for our faculty to play. We have faculty research fellows, both internal and external to the College of Charleston. And we have opportunities to bring in faculty to share their research and engagement. This week is our 14th annual Adam Smith Week, and it's something that has become sort of a hallmark and marquee for our program, and one that we've become really proud of and actually known for. We've had both international and national recognition, both for the center and for specifically this program. So I want to go ahead and get started on our program for this afternoon. Today, we're going to talk about criminal justice reform, and we have three amazing women to talk to you. Very excited about this. So we have with us today Briana McGinnis, who is a professor of political science here at the College of Charleston. Allie, I'm going to apologize.
It's Menegakis.
Menegakis. All right, Allie Menegakis, who is a public defender and started a nonprofit for criminal justice reform here in South Carolina. And Professor Jennifer Baker is a professor of philosophy here at College of Charleston. So Brianna's done work on reentry. Allie, obviously, as a public defender, has taken a lot of these issues on and is dealing with this in her nonprofit. And Professor Baker has done a lot on policing. Right? And so I was really pleased that I could bring the three of them together to talk to us about this, what I think is an incredibly important topic. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you ladies to get us started.
Well, I can't thank you enough. I'm so grateful to my favorite students who showed up too. And I'm just going to take 10 minutes. I really appreciate this chance to think about criminal justice together, because one of my contentions, and it's not just me alone, but you know, also the conclusion of like legal scholars like William Stuntz, that we don't have active justifications for our system. Like we just don't have any explanation of it, not for parts of it, not for it in its entirety, not for the various incentives and motivations in place, not even to tie together the messaging that's associated with parts of our criminal justice system. So if you don't mind, if there's a person next to you, if you would just say out loud, and you too, what do you think the best effort is? What's the best effort you can make to give some justification for just arresting and then prosecuting someone who has committed a crime? And then if you don't mind, focus on the crimes that we arrest for most often here in Charleston. So just if you guys will take 5 seconds to do this. What's the reason for it?
Should be that they like. Should be that they've harmed someone in some way, shape, or form, right? Right. Potential for harm.
What would happen if we didn't do it?
Right. So
Okay.
someone else I would argue versus yourself.
Like in my classes, I really do give people like 5 seconds. We'll gather that data before we end. I do want to compare our answers to what we might get if we think about Adam Smith. And I'm not a Smithian scholar, but I have been focusing on our poor justifications for the criminal justice system, which is kind of up my alley. And I'm going to suggest there are 3 ways Adam Smith gets us to think. I think in a new way. You know, so it opens up some new avenues of thinking about why people commit crimes. This is just an example of our most common arrests here in Charleston, updated for 2020. There's actually been a lot of change due to work of people like Allie. I mean, it's actually a fascinating type of change, because I think marijuana possession was #1 for a couple years. But the fact that we might not even have that list memorized is part of my point, why we need to think about these things in kind of in a new way. And usually it's so fun to go to Adam Smith Week, because you have a lot of economists in the room, and you guys are always good to talk to. And of course, those of you who are economists know that you guys are known for the economic approach to criminal justice. And Gary Becker in 1968 revived interest in this, although there is an older precedent that I'll actually get to in a moment. But he's been interviewed about what motivated him to take an economic approach to crime. And this was actually the story that he realized he was calculating when it came to where to park. And he uses this language, criminals like ordinary citizens. So we'll tease about that a little bit. It's great that economists started to look at criminal justice, because there is some downright embarrassing history when it comes to theories about why people commit crimes. So it's much better than what we used to do, which was like trying to figure out what type of person had a criminal nature. An economic approach to criminal justice treats people, no differently than they treat firms. It's a kind of neutral approach. Let's just look at the type of incentives and the type of exposure or peer effects that we could bring about in order to reduce behavior that has high social costs. So it's kind of a neutral, non-moralizing approach. And economists are great on some of these subjects. In fact, I want to emphasize that even Becker, so this was in a 2015 interview, he reminds us that if we're looking at deterrence with the economic eye, that includes not just punishment, but education and providing better alternatives. Like that's part of the bundle. I'm not sure people always associate that with this economic approach to crime. And then Adam Smith was many things, but he was also an economic thinker, in his way. And he had the same kind of suggestion as we see, from Becker in the 1960s. Just like economists do so well, he points out the counterintuitive nature of things that are the case. So in this case, he's trying to explain that there's more murder in Paris because people are treated terribly and have low incomes. And then, of course, Adam Smith, he's suggesting that if people had more resources, they would have more options than being arrested. And then here's just an example of, economists are all over this stuff. If you want to know what % higher fine induces a 0.23% drop in timely compliance for a speeding ticket, they are on your side. So I'm a big fan of some of this, because we often assume, things like the drug war works, and economists, haven't been listened to that much on that issue, but they've certainly handled it. We assume all sorts of interventions work, and they don't. And as an example, a few weeks ago, I was giving a talk and I got this wonderful comment or criticism that was just jaywalking. So I was trying to interpret that, but the point was supposed to be, or I guess his point was, we don't jaywalk because there are penalties for jaywalking. There's a state code against jaywalking here. I don't think there's a Charleston city ban on jaywalking. I don't think it gets enforced here, though they could with the state code. But there's more jaywalking and a lot of deaths from jaywalking in the US and in places where it's not made illegal. And also I was really surprised at that suggestion, because I jaywalk all the time. You know what I mean? It was like assuming people don't jaywalk, but I jaywalk several times a day, despite the fact that technically I could be taken to jail for it. It was a long time ago, but I think I first started paying attention to criminal justice because of how a college student was treated when she got arrested for jaywalking at University of Texas, where I used to be. And she had her earphones in, so she didn't know what was happening, and she was really terrorized. She was tackled, and the thing that surprised me was that so many people in the comments of the video were supportive of her being treated that way. and as an ethicist, that's what bugs me, that like after the fact moralizing, and you don't find that in The Economist. These are the sort of questions, I mean, if I were better at making slides, these would be like thought bubbles, but these are the sort of questions that I think economists might not mind, but are not in their purview. And I'm going to suggest that Adam Smith is more than just an economist. It sounds like a slight. I don't mean that as a slight. But he actually dealt with moral psychology. And I just want to point out, there are a couple of reasons why turning to him on moral psychology could actually be helpful, because it might give us some overlooked avenues or explanations for why we might want to punish in the first place. So the first one that he suggests, is that need alone is not motivation enough for crime. So it is a motivation for crime, but you also are going to have the indignation of the poor against the rich, and that's prompted by envy. He says, whenever there's great property, there's great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. The affluence of the rich excites the indignation of the poor, who are both driven by want and prompted by envy to invade his possessions. So, you know, it's just a reminder, this is not a contemporary thinker. And he seems pretty comfortable, fully comfortable with the idea that we need a policing system because we will always have poor people. So like, I'm not recommending we consider that or endorse that today. He's also worth listening to because he was actually responding to the predecessor of Becker and the other economists who work on criminal justice. So it was called the legal Enlightenment. And so Smith was reacting to it because he did not accept that we were rationally calculating every time we committed a crime and we were just taking the best opportunity. And then I've mentioned these things already. Okay, here's the second point. We are the ones who hold up as admirable wealth over virtue. So that's what our society does. So if a poor person is motivated to take something illegally, they got the idea from our culture and society. And then the third one is that we aren't motivated, despite how, I mean, some economists can incorporate things like honor, but despite the simple explanation of how we're motivated for, you know, maximizing benefits or rewards, there is this factor Smith suggests, which is that we do things for reasons of like honor or ego. So that would be behavior that, you know, will make no sense if you're looking at it in terms of risk and reward. I don't know if I emphasized this, but maybe it was clear enough. But, you know, Becker really thinks what we're calculating is the risk of getting caught, you know, so maybe the risk and reward calculation is easy, but how likely are you to get caught? When it comes to how likely we are to get caught, Smith is also thinks we're very terrible at that because of our self-regard. So we assume that we're smarter than the average person and we're going to get away with it. We're just not good at calculating those odds. Another thing he suggests is that the poor have to behave better than the wealthy. There are going to be two different sets of consequences. The standards are higher for people who are not affluent in a society. Here are the things I'm hoping Smith can inspire in us. I like some of these because I've actually heard a few of them suggested by Allie. People don't always know what the consequences are of their behavior. Is that fair to say? So people might have a gun in their car here in South Carolina and have no idea they're not getting out of that charge in particular. That's going to be a big problem. From a Smithian perspective, that's the kind of thing we would know to look for. And then the second one is that if people are acting out of out of honor or a feeling of not being well regarded by others. Maybe interventions, you know, in their lives earlier on to look for ways to honor. I mean, Smith wouldn't mind this, but to honor virtue rather than wealth. Maybe those could actually be effective. The third, I'm getting this from William Stuntz, but we've really normalized incarceration. So it's not such a strange thing in some people's lives to go through. The rates of incarceration in some of our communities are higher than the rates of arrest in Stalinist Russia. So it becomes normalized, and that means it's no longer a disincentive. So we're just kind of spreading out this pain for no benefit. And then the fourth one would be, you know, the first point I made with Smith, the economist. If we increase affluence, then we're going to increase the value. We're going to increase the value of people's conventional options and decrease the value of the illegal options. And the last slide I have is just the sort of questions. These aren't necessarily attached to Smith, but as a philosopher, these are the questions that I would love for us to, you know, explore, because these are the questions I don't see us having any coherent answer to, not even in our judge issued court decisions. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Allie Menegakis. I'm an attorney. I practice criminal defense. I was a public defender for 7 years, both in South Florida and here in Charleston. But I now practice in a private criminal defense firm. And yes, I am the executive director and founder of South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots organization dedicated to reforming our system in South Carolina. We include in our team individuals that are in academics like Jen, Dr. Baker, formerly incarcerated individuals, people who have been impacted by the system, practitioners, both in mental health as well as in criminal defense or prosecution, and others who are interested in reform in South Carolina. Jen, can I ask you to, I don't know if Brianna's pulling her slide up. Can I pull up that one? Well, actually, it's okay, Brianna. I am not a philosopher. I am not a political scientist like my incredible colleagues here. I am a practitioner. I, graduated from law school and was immediately hooked when it came to defending the little guy, frankly, against the overwhelming government and protecting the constitutional rights of all of us. One thing, we comment on a lot and use a lot in SU for CJR is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King from the Birmingham jail: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." If one person's rights are violated, then it affects all of our rights. And, Jen brings up an interesting point or quote that Adam Smith made: "We will always need police if there are poor people." I don't necessarily disagree with him in that regard. Now, I would change it to say we will always have crime if there are poor people. And when I say that, I don't mean that poor people commit crime because they are bad people, but rather poor people don't have the resources, the money, to prevent this type of action from occurring. And as long as our society continues to disregard the needs, the social needs, and significant issues that plague our country, we will always have crime. And police won't help that. And that also brings up the other point. What I was interested in is the slide that Jen had that lists all the common crimes or the most frequent crimes from 2020. What is crime, right? Who decides what a crime is? I mean, obviously, Christianity, we have certain rules and laws that we abide by. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. But that's not a crime, right? Who makes crimes? Us, our legislators, the voters, politicians, judges, people. And crimes are always changing. What was a crime 60 years ago is no longer. And new crimes keep popping up. So the issue of, whether we need police or whether we need crime is really relative to what our society is going through at the time. For example, is it illegal to drive under the influence of alcohol? No, it's not. It's illegal to drive to the point where your normal faculties are impaired. But who decides that? How do we know if someone's normal faculties are impaired? Well, in South Carolina and many other states, if you blow in a breathalyzer machine and your blood alcohol level is above 0.08, then it's assumed that you are driving under the influence. But if you don't blow into that machine, which is your right, and I don't advise doing that, then how do you decide? Well, normal officers give what they call a field sobriety exercise, which they practice every day and know by heart. But a normal person, like Jen said, who may never have done an exercise like that, or may have already impaired normal faculties based on health, age, other problems, may not be able to perform that as well as a strong officer who's physically able to do that kind of career. Firearm possession violations. Is it illegal to possess a gun? Of course not. In fact, we have the Second Amendment that says that we have the right to bear arms. So why is that a crime? Well, it's a crime because legislators have certain restrictions on that. And why do they create those restrictions? That's a talk for another day. And do they educate those who get firearms on what those restrictions are? One thing that I've noticed a lot in the last few years, especially also in Charleston County, is this, what I think is a response to the defund the police movement, which is now going back to this rhetoric that we are comfortable with in America, which is tough on crime, fear mongering, if you will. That we have increasing violent charges in Charleston. We have increasing gun problem in our community, but we don't. We have firearm possession violations, but that is simply not having your registration up to date, having your gun in a certain place in your car as opposed to the glove compartment or the trunk. People get arrested and taken to jail for that. So I think it's important to, when we're talking about why people commit crime, again, what Jen was saying, a lot of people don't know that they're committing it, and should it be a crime to begin with is always a question I have. We have a gigantic mass incarceration problem in our country, one of the worst in the world, and it's not getting better. Economically, it doesn't make sense because it doesn't even work. People are not becoming rehabilitated in prison nor jail. In fact, they're digressing because they're coming out with less resources than they went into the system with. I'd also like to speak a little bit, when we're talking about the functionality of our system and whether it's economical or not, the process by which we punish people. I'd like to comment, as Jen knows and Briana know, about a right to a speedy trial. Does anyone know, do we have a constitutional right to a speedy trial in the United States of America? Yes. And how long does it take for a trial to be speedy under that? Since COVID? Well, I mean, under the Constitution, what constitutes a speedy trial?
It's not defined.
Not defined. How long should it be? Let's say I'm arrested today. How long should I be brought to trial before it ceases to be a speedy trial?
24 hours, because you're going to work, you may have family to take
24 hours, I love that. A year? Is that too long? Yeah. 6 months? Does it depend on the crime? The average wait time for a trial in Charleston County is 4 to 5 years right now. And no, that's not just because of COVID. South Carolina doesn't define by law or statute how long it should take for a case to go to trial. Other states do. Florida, for example, 90 days from your arrest for a misdemeanor charge, you must be brought to trial. Felony charge, 180 days from your arrest, you must be brought to trial. If you're not, then the case gets dismissed. As a defense attorney, as a defendant, I have the right to waive that speedy trial right until I'm ready, until I take depositions, which we don't have here, until I find witnesses and create a defense for my client, which is his right. And then I can demand that trial, and it has to be brought within 50 days. We don't have that here. So people that are arrested for any one of those charges and are too poor to pay money to a bondsman to get out of jail will, if they want to exercise their constitutional right to a speedy trial, sit in jail for 4 to 5 years. That is not just. My opinion, it's not constitutional. I imagine it's not economical. What we need to do is stop looking at the criminal justice system as a punitive means and start comparing it to the way we are attempting to address the healthcare system. Is it more economical to invest resources, time, education in preventing something like diabetes, or to try and treat it after it's already been diagnosed? Probably prevention, right? Is it expensive? Sure. Does it cost money? Of course. But it's more effective. We need to do that the same thing with our criminal justice system. Crime will always exist because social issues exist. As a public defender and a criminal defense attorney, the majority of my clients suffered from one of the following: mental illness, homelessness, substance use. The reason they commit crime is not because they're bad people, but because they lack resources to help them with their underlying issues. If we can address the cause of these symptoms, symptom being the crime, then perhaps we can reduce that crime in the end. Until we start investing in our criminal justice system, in these social issues, we will continue to see crime at a steady increase. We will continue to see our prison system over-incarcerating, and we will continue to see a lack of success in the way we deal with crime and the punishment of those involved. Thank you so much.
I pulled the political theorist power move here and I brought the text with me the whole way. So to build on what Dr. Baker and Ms. Menegakis have already begun establishing. So I want to speak specifically about the theory of moral sentiments. So Adam Smith, obviously very famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, very famous for The Wealth of Nations, but he had another book that he wrote before The Wealth of Nations, and that is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is exactly what it sounds like. So Dr. Baker noted that Smith was a moral psychologist in addition to everything else that he was doing, and the theory of moral sentiments really digs deep into his moral psychology. I, like as Dr. Baker said, am also not primarily a Smith scholar, but I have a background in the history of political thought and a little bit of a background in the Scottish Enlightenment, so I'm not going to let my lack of expertise stop me from talking to you today. So I like to think of Adam Smith as the James Cameron of the Scottish Enlightenment, because like James Cameron, he didn't put out a lot of stuff, but everything he put out was a banger, right? So like Theory of Moral Sentiments, Wealth of Nations, he had a couple of other essays. Most of his papers he had burnt upon his death, but there's other stuff floating around out there, but these are his two major works. You will note that the theory of moral sentiments came out before the Wealth of Nations. Also, interesting fact, the Wealth of Nations doesn't mention the theory of moral sentiments, which is not to say that these two things are independent of each other. I'm really observant. So what I want to talk about today are a couple of ideas that Adam Smith did a lot with. They aren't necessarily specific to him or exclusive to him, but I specifically want to focus on sympathy, which was something that a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment writers were really concerned with. Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like Hume were also really invested in this moral psychology project, and sympathy is central to that. So you could get a lot of different takes on exactly what the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers thought sympathy was. This is kind of a distillation and a general way of defining this. So sympathy is a capacity that all human beings have, right? And so Adam Smith says that all human beings have the capacity to put ourselves imaginatively into the place of another. And not just to see things from their point of view, right? This isn't just an epistemic question, but also so that we can vicariously experience their emotions, right? And so this is what we now in like 2022 refer to as empathy or something like that. So sympathy in the Scottish Enlightenment isn't exactly the same thing as what we mean by empathy today, but as far as working definitions of the concepts, they are fairly close. So sympathy can be with either positive emotions or negative emotions. We often think of sympathy as something that we feel when someone else is suffering. That might be better defined, as Smith says, as compassion, right? So if you break the word compassion down to its roots, com means with, passion means to suffer, it's suffering with somebody else. But sympathy isn't necessarily suffering together. It's just feeling something together, and it can be positive or it can be negative. But Smith tells us we are not prompted to feel those things always by the same things or in the same measures. And I'll return to that momentarily. Smith also discusses resentment in a fair bit of detail in the theory of moral sentiments. So resentment is also a capacity that human beings have. But this is a capacity to bear ill will towards somebody, to attribute blame to them, generally on the basis of something that they are done or believed to have done. So generally on the basis of past action, and we can be just in our blame or we can be unjust. Let's see, I don't know anybody's name. So ma'am, you in the back of the scarf. Do you generally think that feeling resentment is good for a political community, or is it bad for a political community if people feel resentment?
I would think bad if it goes too long.
Okay, good. So if it goes too long, if it's directed at the wrong things, if it foments faction, resentment can be bad, right? And we hear a lot of criticism of resentment. Smith actually holds out the possibility that resentment can be good, right? That resentment can motivate us to intercede when we see injustice in ways that we might not otherwise, because again, we are able to imaginatively put ourselves into the place of another person. I want to recommend this book that I have at the bottom of the slide here. This is Recognizing Resentment, Sympathy, Injustice, and Liberal Political Thought by Michelle Schwarzy. She goes into a great deal of detail in discussing the role of resentment in the Scottish Enlightenment moral psychology project. She covers Smith, Hume, and others. But if that's something you're interested in, that's a great place to go for it. All right, and then finally, Smith does not talk about intuitions, but contemporary philosophers love to talk about intuitions. Am I wrong, Dr. Baker? Yeah, you're right. Okay, so philosophers love to talk about intuitions, and philosophers of punishment particularly like to talk about intuitions. So this is, again, a very kind of like quick and dirty definition of this. I fell down a very deep and unproductive rabbit hole trying to find a single definition of intuitions. But these are beliefs or judgments that are made without like direct inference. We might think of these as like dispositions to believe. So if I were to say, when we came in the door today, I held the door for Allie, and I need a kidney. So now Allie owes me a kidney because I held the door for her. My guess is everybody in this room has the same intuition that that is unreasonable, right? That this is not a morally approvable request. So that is something that you experience without reflecting on it. You don't have to sort of like sort out what your premises are to get to that conclusion. So we might think of intuitions in their best form as a kind of like shortcut method of reasoning, but there's still reasoning behind them. Now, intuitions are, they are subject to all kinds of criticism. For instance, they are not justifications, right? They are feelings, and they can express things that are not just. So they can be, again, useful, or they can be harmful when we are making moral judgments. Right? So these are our basic concepts that I'll be working with. Are there any questions before I proceed? Anybody want to vent their resentments? Okay. So here we have Smith discussing sympathy in the theory of moral sentiments. What's going to be on my slides mainly are going to be passages from Smith, because everybody reads The Wealth of Nations and hardly anybody reads the theory of moral sentiments except for Dr. Baker, obviously does as well. And Dr. Calcagno also has. So I want to put some of the text up there because it might be less familiar. So why am I talking about sympathy and moral intuitions and resentments on a criminal justice panel? Well, because I think Adam Smith has a lot of things actually to tell us about how we should approach specifically people who have in the past committed criminal offenses. As Dr. Calcagno, I'm sorry, I'm choking on your name today. Calcagno told you at the beginning of our introductions, I work in part on reentry, and the unbelievable bias against people with criminal records and the antipathy that the general public tends to feel towards people who've committed crimes is a huge barrier to people being able to build lives, and not even like re-enter, but actually sort of like enter the broader society and economy in the first place. So I think that we should really be thinking about who we sympathize with, who we resent, and why. So here we see Smith say, in every passion of which the mind of man is susceptible, the emotions of the bystander always correspond to what, by bringing the case home to himself, he imagines should be the sentiments of the sufferer. So we also get this spectator relation here in this passage, which is obviously very important to Smith's broader philosophy. But I think this is also important to how we view punishment. So when I was thinking about this presentation today, and I was thinking about the work that I'm doing currently on punishment and reentry, and specifically I'm writing on prison education right now, I was thinking that this has points of contact with retributive theories of justice that I think are worth unpacking, which is kind of what I'm doing today. So full disclosure, I am trying this out on you. You are my guinea pigs today. All right, so as I said a moment ago, we don't feel sympathy in the same measures for everything, and we don't feel resentment in the same measures for everything. So actions or people that might provoke our resentment more, or I'm sorry, our happiness more easily than our sympathy for their pain. So Smith explains that in this passage here, again, from the theory of moral sentiments. So he says, we're not half so anxious that our friends should adopt our friendships as that they should enter into our resentments. So we can forgive them for not being as affected by our joy, but we lose all patience if they seem indifferent about the injuries which may have been done to us. All right, so in plain language, this means that, yes, right, like we expect to share our emotions with other people, and we expect other people to extend their sympathy to us. And when our friends are with us and we are feeling the same emotions, we are less invested in them being happy for us than we are in them feeling resentment on our account when we've been wronged. So if we take Smith seriously with this contention, this leads to, I think, a really troubling imbalance in terms of how people extend their sympathy. So we might forget very quickly the good turns that are done us, and resent for a long time the bad turns that are done us. Right, and that is important when we are dealing with fellow feeling. So Smith periodically refers to sympathy as fellow feeling, right? So this is again feeling something with somebody. So to have fellow feeling, you are going to have a given community of potential fellow feelers, right? Not an elegant term, but there is going to be a limited number of people that you are going to engage in these kinds of relations with. And we don't necessarily extend this sympathy or this resentment on the basis of particularly good reasons all the time. So I'm now going to turn to some discussion of expressive retributivism, which is a mouthful. Is anybody here familiar with expressive retributivism? Okay, then I am going to tell you about it. We'll come back to this in just a second. All right, so expressive retributivism is one approach to punishment. There's a lot of literature on this. It often comes up, I have found, in discussions, particularly of benefits being given to people who are returning citizens, and specifically educational benefits, right? So often the argument will go something like this. Why should that person get a college education? They don't deserve it. My kid can't go to school for free, or on these Pell Grants. So why should a criminal get something that an innocent person cannot get? They don't deserve it. So expressive retributivism is a variety of retributivism, which is to say, one of the justifications for punishing is that we just want retribution. So the traditional justifications for punishment in legal and to an extent moral philosophy are restraint, right, to stop people from continuing their wrongdoing. Rehabilitation, right, we have not a lot of evidence that happens in prisons. And retribution. So we're pretty uncomfortable, generally speaking, with retribution. But there has been a fair bit of work on this in the last 20 years that is unpacking the function of retributivism and examining whether or not this can be justified. So the person who initially pioneered this idea of expressive retributivism, which is to say, sometimes we want retribution or pain and hard treatment inflicted on someone who's done wrong, not just to rehabilitate them, not just sort of to vent our anger at them, but actually to express something. So by expressing disapproval or disapprobation of what this person has done, we send a message to the broader society that we do not endorse this. We send a message to the victim that we respect them. That's kind of the end of the conversation. So there's somebody missing from this formula. Who is missing from this formula? The person who's committed the offense. And so they are reduced to this position of either being a message, right? So this person then becomes like a cautionary tale, or worse, becoming the medium that is used to convey the message. So you may be thinking now, what does this have to do with Adam Smith? Well, this brings us back around to who we resent and who we extend our sympathy to. So on the one hand, we might have pro-social reasons to resent people who have committed crimes, right? And so those might be good reasons to punish people who have committed offenses. But those are not necessarily good reasons to continually reduce the life chances of people who have criminal convictions. And there's a point at which the resentment is no longer pro-social, right? The resentment becomes self-perpetuating. And so I wanted to draw attention to this participation. If you're not afraid, you can stand up and dance. To suggest that maybe those of us who are not criminalized, right? So those of us who do not have criminal records should be thinking a little bit harder about who we extend our sympathy to and why. Smith discusses our tendency to sympathize with the wealthy and the powerful. So this is in Theory of Moral Sentiments. Dr. Baker touched on this as well. And so Smith tells us that, not only are we uneven in our extension of sympathy and resentment, but we are also uneven in how likely we are to view somebody with sympathy versus resentment. And so the wealthy and powerful, he tells us we are likely to sympathize with. We put ourselves in their place, even though our experiences are wildly different from theirs. By contrast, we are much less likely to put ourselves in the place of someone who is of a lower social condition, who is poor, who is in some way an outsider. So I want to stretch maybe Smith a little bit to use this text to challenge this account of retributivism. So if we think that we are engaging in retributivism to express something, then we should consider who we are including in that circle of possible sympathizers, and to ask ourselves whether perhaps some of the resentment that the public feels towards people who have criminal records may not be on the basis of something that is not particularly just, right? It may be some of these tendencies to sympathize with the person who is in a more advantaged situation and not sympathize with the person who's in a less advantaged situation. So I'm going to just conclude by suggesting that sympathy can have a lot of power in terms of how we approach things like criminal justice reform. So if we, for instance, think, oh, well, this could actually be me, right? And most people don't think that that could be them. And you can guarantee that you're never going to commit a criminal offense, although actually I would question that as well, because if you've ever seen the criminal code of any given state, it's huge and you've probably committed crimes today. But you cannot guarantee that you will not be drawn into this dragnet. And one of the critiques that is often given of expressive retributivism and other theories of punishment is that we, the public, the non-criminalized public, tend to automatically sympathize with the person who has been the victim of the crime to the exclusion of being able to sympathize with the offender. And if we want to be making sound moral judgments, I would suggest that perhaps we should extend that circle of sympathy to include people who have done wrong, in addition to people who have suffered wrong. Okay, thank you very much.
So we've got time, we can open it up to questions. If anyone in the audience, we like to generally give our market process scholars a first shot if they have questions.
My question is, would you say that a big factor in turning the conversation to being sympathetic towards also the offender rather than just the victim is on a large part of the role of like media and people who report on crimes? Like, is there anything like that the general public can do?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on that. Yes, so I think part of the problem is media coverage also turning crime and violence into entertainment. So typically, I don't know how many of you are true crime fans. No one wants to admit it, but everybody listens to true crime. So I'm going to assume all of you. But so true crime certainly invites us to put ourselves in sympathy with the victim, and does tend to cast the offender as being evil. But I think this also arises from our criminal legal system, which is adversarial. And so this sets up a situation in which there are incentives to completely demonize the offender while completely exonerating, the person who's suffered the offense from having any sort of like part in what occurred or in what is about to occur as the trial and punishment continues. That is also not my idea. This comes from a theorist named Niels Christie, who argued that we should instead treat crimes as conflicts, right, instead of this adversarial competition. I don't know if I answer your question or not, but so short answer, yes, the media is terrible. Also the legal system.
Ms. Menegakis,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, going in, starting your career as a public defender, probably, I imagine you could have some less to kind of get about. Then you said you left it 8 years later. What was your perspective when you came in and when you left?
I loved being a public defender every single day that I was there. I felt like I found a calling where I never worked ever. I enjoyed every minute of it, even the terrible ones. It's the purest form of practicing law, in my opinion, because you are standing up to the government, representing people, defending their constitutional rights, truly helping people when a lot of times they've never been helped or had a voice before. But you're very astute. I did leave. One of the reasons I left was because I recognized, like Dr. McGinnis said, that there are flaws in the system. One of the flaws, if you want to call it that, is that because it's adversarial, as a public defender, I could not speak to or advocate to the larger issues at stake. If I did, it would jeopardize my client or any future clients that I had. And I knew that there needed, no matter how good of a lawyer I wasn't going to really be helping my clients in the way that they needed to be helped, which was changing the laws that exist or need to exist. So I don't think that, I became jaded. I don't think I lost any ideals. I think I was enlightened, but by what needed to be done and empowered to do so.
Can I just follow up with that?
Sure.
Because I think that's really interesting how you approach and just the statistics you reported is shocking that people are waiting 45 years for a trial and then of course losing your job and all the rest. What if you could do one or two things that would change the incentives of South Carolina to make it more like Florida, much speedier trials? What would you do to change those incentives by that?
Well, there's only one thing that needs to be done. We need to have a speedy trial right in the state, which we don't have. There needs to be a limitation and rules regarding trials. The hesitation, and I think the fear by a lot of people in the system, or at least in the legislature, is that that's going to take money. I'll give you an example, like we need more judges. When I was in Florida, I went to court every single day. At 8:30, I didn't get out until around 11. And every single day I was in court doing pleas, negotiating, bond reconsideration hearings, motion hearings. I go, even as public defender here, I maybe went to court once or twice a month. They only had dockets once or twice a month. They only have trials. I mean, they only had 2 trials the last, 2 years, I think 2 or 3. And so we need more court time. And the only way to do that is to have more judges in court and require that, and to have a speedy trial rule. But I mean, the other problem, other than the fact that people are going to be incarcerated, losing, their housing, supporting loved ones, is that losing their jobs, is that it doesn't help the efficiency of the system. Because what happened in Florida is the prosecutors on the other side of the table from me it would be impossible for the prosecutor's office to try every single case that came in within that speedy trial time. So what do? They triage. They focus on the more serious cases, the ones where there really was serious crime, and the ones that aren't as important, let's say a possession of drug case, they would either give you a good deal or dismiss it. They did that because they had this ticking clock for speedy trial. We don't have that here. There's no incentive. So we don't get as good deals here. There's no incentive to get deals. And what do people do? They plead guilty to probably offers that they probably could get better if they had a speedy trial already. So I really do believe, and I think that it addresses, incarceration and mass incarceration as well, and reentry, is that I advocate and support my partners that are in reentry and that are in education in the prison system. But I do believe that if we change the process and reduce the amount of people entering the system, the resources that the legislature does afford to them can be better used to where they need to be. And until we start reducing that funnel and influx of people going into the systems, we're never going to have enough money to treat everyone.
We have a question from.
This is from Adrian Moore. Can you talk about how society views accusation versus conviction? It seems that punishment often starts at the time of accusation. When someone is arrested, we forget all about innocent until proven guilty and presume guilt, hence the massive pretrial confinement. And when a celebrity is accused of wrongdoing, many begin punishing them immediately, not waiting for proof or a trial or even a chance to defend themselves. As a society, do we even believe in innocent until proven guilty? It wasn't directed to any one person, so whoever wants to.
I would quickly say, no, we don't. But maybe that's a reason that it's built into the system, because it goes against, the ways we naturally feel.
I think that's a good question. In terms of whether or not there is like a significant difference. I mean, obviously, right, like if you're serving a sentence, that's going to have a bigger impact on your life. But it is true that just being arrested and charged can also have a significant impact on your life, which Allie, I'm sure you can say more about than me. But in terms of how celebrities are treated, I might push back against that a little bit in terms of how celebrities are tried in the public eye, because often I think that does happen, but they generally come out of it pretty okay. And I guess I would follow Adam Smith on that one, in saying that we do tend to have more sympathy and forbearance for people who are wealthy and powerful.
Yeah, I mean, innocent and proven unless, I like to say, proven guilty beyond any reasonable doubt, is the core value of what I do. And it's incredible to me how difficult it is to get even prosecutors to understand that concept. Briana, you talk about, our legal system, the adversarial nature of it, that the prosecution is there to almost villainize and prosecute the person. What I remind my colleagues at the solicitor's office and prosecutors, their job is not to convict. Do you know what the job of a prosecutor, the oath of the prosecutor is? It's to seek justice. Justice does not mean conviction. That is what the goal is, and that is what I think needs to be emphasized more to the government when it comes to prosecuting cases. If the just thing to do is to dismiss the case because there was racial profiling, then they would be doing their job. That is their role, not to punish and prevent.
So I want to follow up on that just a little bit, because I agree with the overall sentiment that you've expressed, but there may also be an instance where conviction is in fact the just thing.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because if they've abrogated the law, the conviction would in fact satisfy the needs of justice.
Why would it do that?
In fact, we've settled upon a social norm within a social contract that suggests that we've agreed upon punishment through the legislative process.
But what is a conviction to you?
What is a conviction?
What does
Conviction
that
is
mean?
a finding by a court that in fact the law has been abrogated.
Does it have to be by a court?
That's the way our system's set up.
Does a judge have to convict you of a crime?
No. No.
Who else can convict you of a crime?
We run a jury system.
Right? A jury. So a jury could come back with not guilty, right? Would that be justice if the prosecution was trying to get them to be convicted?
If in fact there is not the evidence, yes, I would call that a just outcome.
But they didn't get the conviction.
Yes, but we're going to end with this
I would
discussion.
say the clarification is seeking a conviction necessarily, not necessarily wanting the conviction, right?
I'm referring to the end result, but
I think if I can jump in here, I think one of the underlying assumptions here is that in the case that the person did in fact break the law, that the conviction or whatever sentence goes with that is just because they deserve it. Is that an accurate reflection?
yeah, based on the current understanding of it. You want to change the underlying assumptions, great.
Okay.
Those are assumptions that exist.
So desert is a very tricky thing, right? So it is again making judgments or perhaps having intuitions on the basis of things that people have done in the past. So I think it is worth perhaps distinguishing between what is justice or what somebody deserves and maybe what the legal sentence is. You know, for a number of reasons, right? Those things are obviously not identical with each other, but also like in the US, we do have, you know, compared to other peer nations, we have very long and harsh sentences, which I think is why you're going to encounter a lot of resistance to the idea that even if the person committed the crime, and that they're convicted, that their punishment is going to be just.
Yeah, I would never argue that the punishment is necessarily justice. My point is that I don't think you can simply exclude conviction as the conviction being a possible just outcome.
Well, let me clarify something, because I think maybe you see it differently than we do in the legal system. The prosecutor's job is not to seek a conviction. The prosecutor's job is to seek justice. And practically what that means is not that they're going to be, in the end, asking for a conviction, but merely presenting the evidence that they are provided by law enforcement. And if that evidence provided by law enforcement meets all the elements, then it is up to the judge or the jury to decide on a conviction. They are merely presenting this information for decision. They are not the ones that are going to be making that decision.
Due respect, that is a naive view of prosecutorial discretion, because they make those discretionary choices all the time.
Right, but what kind of discretion do they use and why do they do that?
Yeah, no, I think that's where the interesting debate is.
Right, well, there's two ways to resolve a case, many ways to resolve a case. There's one that is essentially what we're supposed to do, which is utilizing your constitutional rights to a trial, a jury trial, presenting evidence, presumption of innocence, right to an attorney. And then there's the option that can be given, but a prosecutor doesn't have to give a plea offer. They never do. They do that if that client or the defendant wants that and an opportunity to resolve the case. So, I mean, I would, you know what I would do? I will invite you to come to my trial next week.
Sure.
And all of you to come. And you can see whether you agree with that seeking of conviction or seeking of justice. And I encourage you, have you ever been to a courtroom and seen a plea deal?
Several hundred.
You have?
Sure, yeah.
Are you a prosecutor?
Yeah.
Are you?
Political scientist by trade.
Okay. I encourage you to come. Have you done it in Charleston here?
No, not from Charleston.
Okay. I encourage you to come one day in Charleston or one of these courts. I will personally take you through the courtroom and we can talk about these in person.
Sure. This is no longer productive. Let's move on.
That was a good question, and I have like one crabby thing to say about Adam Smith. I don't know if anyone will appreciate, but the way we don't, mentally respect innocent until proven guilty, he will explain as the thrill we get from thinking of ourselves as ordinary citizens, the way Gary Becker did. Remember that little line, if you remember, so he's like, I also considered, breaking the parking law, and I'm an ordinary citizen. But if we get to categorize people as criminal or non-criminal, we get that little ego thrill, so by what we do naturally. Smith, I think, is okay with that as well. Yeah, so.
So, throughout the discussion, one of the two big topics has been sort of the public approach to how we view justice. And I think it's easy to look for solutions in the way the criminal justice system is structured but I'm curious what all of your ideas are for sort of addressing the societal aggression, the aggression of the towards the accused or convicted.
Well, I'm just hoping affluence and non-neglect help, honoring virtue over wealth, I would hope resources help.
Yeah, I think awareness is a big thing. I think that, like Dr. McGinnis said, there's a lot of focus in media out there when it comes to villainizing the accused, but bringing the attention to the difficulties that many of the accused face and have faced throughout their lives, to encourage that sympathy, that empathy, to see that maybe this person who is labeled as a criminal isn't much different than me.
What is it, like 1 in 4 Americans now have a criminal record? So the fact that so many people have convictions, this is, I guess, like kind of a dark optimism, might lead to people being able to extend that circle of sympathy because you know somebody who has a criminal record. I guarantee that you know somebody who has a criminal record. You probably know somebody who has been convicted of a felony. And I think destigmatizing returning citizens is important. And I do think that media representations are a problem, right? So there's a literature on what's referred to as like prison voyeurism. So on the one hand, yeah, we want people to be able to see what happens to people who are brought into the system so that they can begin to empathize with it, right? And see what they're actually supporting in terms of policy. But there is also like a fine line there, right? Where again, punishment then gets turned into entertainment instead of material that we can seriously grapple with.
I'll take the prerogative. I might make this the last question, but I want to kind of tie back a few things that you all mentioned and just things that occurred to me in thinking about this in the first place. Right? Allie mentioned this, that there's lots of things, crimes today that were not crimes, in the past. And to what degree is the fact that as state power and government's grown, we've simply taken away opportunities, economic opportunities of individuals, right? Through a variety of things, whether it's prohibition of things, licensing, right? Regulation of some kind, right? That we remove sort of these first rungs of maybe economic opportunity that only, it doesn't necessitate crime, right? But it doesn't help in that individuals don't have, right? So they may continue to do these things, but then they have to do them in an underground way that doesn't make them nefarious, but they are now quote unquote criminal, right? And now we've got situations in which people are just merely trying to seek out economic opportunities, right? But can't do so in a way that they otherwise would have maybe in the past. And I just want to know how much you think that plays a role in the fact that the government has created these sort of barriers to entry and call it economic mobility, right? As something that's going on in this instance. And that maybe if we can remove some of those barriers, right, that this would go a long way in reforming the system. And it's not necessarily directed at
No,
Allie,
I mean, you're absolutely right. One of my colleagues who's actually giving a TED talk in 10 minutes, so I'm going to leave after I comment on this, says that the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. There are restrictions. We have created debtors' prisons. It's what we have, debtors' jails, where people who can't pay their child support, get suspended licenses, are incarcerated for months at a time in an attempt to pay their debts. They get out and that debt has increased. It's not functioning. I think that there's a reason for that. I think certain communities are just really impacted by it. But again, I think that's a conversation that I'd love to get into more another day as to why that happens. I apologize that I have to leave, but I'm running over to the Charleston Music Hall to go catch one of our board members who's giving that talk. He's a formerly incarcerated individual, Keith Smalls. I encourage you to check it out online when it's streaming. But thank you, Dr. McGinnis. Thank you, Doctor. I'm sorry to cut out right now, but my right is here.
Thank you, Allie.
Actually, do mind if I follow up on that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I've also done some work on collateral consequences, which is actually what led me to working on prison education. And so I think there are a lot of issues there, right? So one, as Allie mentioned, that some local municipalities are really dependent on punishment as a revenue generator, right? Which is hugely problematic. You really don't want your criminal justice to be what's funding, right, your city services, or you give really bad incentives to your law enforcement officials. But the other thing is, so I think you mentioned collateral consequences, right? Like, so prohibiting certain people from getting certain kinds of licenses. These are so common. There are, I think at this point, something like 5,000 different collateral consequences across the United States. It is to the point that judges who hand down sentences don't know what the effect of that sentence is going to be after the person is released. Attorneys don't know what the effect of the sentence is going to be after the person is released because the collateral consequences are so many and so complicated. And many of them have to do with your economic opportunities. And so specifically licensure. There are states where you cannot get a license to braid hair if you have a white collar felony, right, or any felony. And so I would challenge any of you to give me a persuasive rationale for why that is. And you know, one of the critiques of this is that it operates as gatekeeping or protectionism for people who are not criminalized to hold on to those higher income jobs or jobs.
Not much to add. Our head of prisons here in South Carolina has said that the jobs that the men, I think he calls them his men, can get when they come out will not work. They don't pay enough. So it's like fast food jobs, like that won't do it. So we don't have a path. There are people that don't know the path, and then if we offer a path that doesn't work, once they learn the path, it's more recidivism.
Let me take this opportunity to thank Baker, Dr. McGinnis, for being here today, and Allie for being here today. Thank you all for coming out. I want to remind you that our next event is this evening at 6 o'clock. We'll be down in Wells Fargo Auditorium. Professor Rachel Ferguson will be speaking tonight on Black liberalization in the marketplace. So I encourage you to come out for that talk. And tomorrow afternoon at 3:30, Dr. Craig Richardson will be speaking on the Dodd-Frank bill and the consequences of economic mobility. So please come out there. If you want to learn more about the center, we have information here on the table. Our students are here, right? Take the opportunity to talk with us. Again, follow us on social media and so forth to keep up with the schedule for the rest of the week. And thank you all.